midst that lead us in our opening prayer. Encamped along the hills of life, ye Christian soldiers rise, and press the battle ere the night shall veil the glowing skies. Against the foe impels below, let all our strength be hurled. Faith is the victory we know, that overcomes the world. Faith is the victory, faith is the victory, oh, glorious victory that overcomes the world. To him who overcomes the foe, what fragrance shall he give? Before the angels he shall know his name confessed in heaven. Then onward from the hills of life, our hearts with love aflame, will vanquish all the hosts of night in Jesus' hungry name. Faith is the victory, faith is the victory, oh, glorious victory that overcomes the world.
Our God and Father in heaven, we're so thankful to Thee for every blessing of life. Especially, Father, are we thankful for the opportunity we have to assemble here for this midweek service, that we may better equip ourselves with the sword of the Spirit, that we may be able to give account for the way that we conduct and go our lives. Father, we ask Thy blessings upon those that are sick and in need of our prayer this evening. We pray for those that have lost loved ones, Stafford family, the Driver family. We pray that Thy comforting hand be about them. We pray, Father, for all that's been in the hospital and that are still in the hospital, that everything humanly possible can be done to bring them to a better state of health. Bless our service tonight. Bless each class, each teacher. May we all say that we've been blessed by being here tonight. Forgive us where we fail Thee in Jesus' name. Amen.
So good to see all of you tonight. We appreciate your presence. We got some of our college students home from school, and we're glad to have you with us. And Faye's able to be here tonight. WA's able to be here. Barry drove the van and went and picked him up. So let's kind of spread the word and let Barry know if there are others who need a ride, and he'll be driving on Wednesday night. And we do appreciate his doing that. And we hope that if I fail to think of it later, hope all of you have a great holiday period. Some of that will start this weekend. It is at our house anyway. And most of us have so many places to go and things to do. We have to start early and go into overtime sometimes to get it all in. But it's a wonderful time of the year, and we can all be thankful that we have our families, but there's some people who don't. So try to remember them as well. Be mentioned a little bit later that Eric Haney lost his sister, and we want to remember that family in our prayers as well. Matthew chapter 15. Matthew chapter 15. Last time we talked about the Canaanite woman and Jesus going among the Gentiles. There was an area west of the Jordan, between the Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea, called Decapolis, and there were 10 cities in that area, or 10 towns, I guess you could call them. And that was an area that was populated or had a heavy Gentile population. And Jesus is in that area in Matthew 16. He has been into the coast of Tyre and Sidon, which were right on the coast of the Mediterranean, and he will begin now moving back to the east toward the Jordan. and the Sea of Galilee in particular, coming back into that area. And so that's where the setting of what we're studying tonight is, the place of it. So let's begin our reading in verse 29. Verse 29, Matthew 15. And Jesus departed from thence and came nigh unto the Sea of Galilee, and went up into a mountain and sat down there. And great multitudes came unto him, having with them those that were lame, blind, dumb, maimed, and many others, and cast them down at Jesus' feet, and he healed them. Insomuch that the multitude wondered when they saw the dumb to speak, the maimed to be whole, the lame to walk, and the blind to see. And they glorified the God of Israel. Then Jesus called his disciples unto him and said, I have compassion on the multitude, because they continue with me now 3 days, and have nothing to eat. And I will not send them away fasting, lest they faint in the way. And his disciples say unto him, Whence should we have so much bread in the wilderness, as to fill so great a multitude? And Jesus said unto them, How many loaves have you? And they said, 7, and a few little fishes. And he commanded the multitude to sit down on the ground. And he took the 7 loaves and the fishes, and gave thanks, and brake them, and gave to his disciples, and the disciples to the multitude. And they did all eat, and were filled. And they took up of the broken meat that was left 7 baskets full. And they who did eat were 4,000 men, beside women and children. And he sent away the multitude, and took ship, and came into the coasts of Magdala. You'll notice that Jesus is going into a lot of coasts. Have you noticed how many times that's mentioned? It was a word just designating a general geographical area. He came into the coast, the vicinity, the region of Tyre and Sidon. And some of the other places it will mention the coast of this city or that city, as it does here into the coast of Magdala, a place incidentally that has been connected with Mary Magdalene, and but really the exact location of it isn't known, and it's difficult to determine exactly where it was. But let's go back and look at this. Jesus is departing from one area, and he is coming back unto the Sea of Galilee. And he went up into a mountain and sat down there. The posture would indicate that he was ready to teach, because people would often sit down, the rabbis would in those days, to teach. You'll notice that it is said he went up into a mountain. When we think of mountains, generally we think of something like the Smokies, or even higher and greater, the Rockies, the Alps. Those are mountains. Some of you remember John Denver, the singer, and he was in Tennessee one time doing a concert, and he was somebody said something about the mountains. He said, "No, you guys have hills. We have mountains in Colorado." And I think there's something to be said for that. But Jesus seemed to be fond of mountains. It'd be an interesting study for you to go through and notice how many times mountains are mentioned in connection with Jesus' ministry. He spent a lot of time on a mountain or in a mountain. He spent time there praying, and he spent time there teaching, didn't he? And of course we have the Mount of Transfiguration as well, where Jesus was transfigured. We'll study about that in Matthew 17. And there's a lot of lessons to be learned from just studying the great mountains of the Bible. You may have never studied the Bible from a geographical standpoint. You just sometimes I think people think, well, those are just fictitious places, you know. They're just something like out of a fairy tale. But those places actually exist. When I was still in high school, Brother Charles Chumley came to Richmond's Chapel. Johnny, I don't know if you were even born at the time or not. Yeah, you probably were. Do you remember anything about that? Okay, that was before your time there then. But Brother Chumley preached at Granny White in Nashville for a long, long time. And he held, I remember 2 or 3 meetings at Richmond's Chapel. But this particular time he came, and he had made a trip to the Bible lands. And he had all kinds of slides. It didn't have the films like we have now and all the technology that we had then, but it was so interesting. And he would take us via those pictures to Mount Nebo or somewhere like that. That's where Moses went up, you know, and viewed the land and died there. And so it's really interesting to study that. If you have an atlas, you can find out a lot of things about the Bible lands. But it's really an intriguing study. I had a class in Bible geography when I was in college, and I've always appreciated it. And though I wanted to go when I was younger, but I don't want to go now, and would dread that trip. But I had a couple of teachers at Lipscomb who went right after the 7 or 8 days war. Depends on who's counting it, I guess. But they were over there, and they drifted into some areas they didn't need to be. And suddenly these guys came up, you know, and just sort of took them by the arms and started escorting them, and finally got them back, I think, to the American Embassy or anyway on safe soil. And they told them, whatever you do, don't go into that area. This war has just ended, and there's still a lot of hard feelings, and it's a wonder both of you didn't have a dagger in your ribs. So don't go there anymore, you know. And sure enough, they told us that they were there walking through a certain area one day around Jerusalem, and all of a sudden this boom, 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 and they thought, oh no, the war started again. But it hadn't. The Israelis were making a film about it. They were already into the production business, making a movie about that war. But anyway, I would have loved to have gone when I was younger, but I have no desire to go now. But the mountains of the Bible, do a study on those sometime, and I believe that you will appreciate it. We're told that great multitudes resorted to him there. They brought their lame, the blind, the dumb, the maimed, and numerous others to be healed by him. The King James says that they cast them down at Jesus' feet. They didn't just bring them and throw them down. I believe the New American Standard Version says they laid them at Jesus' feet. They were not, you know, a people without compassion. They loved the people that they were bringing and wanted them to be healed. And they recognized that Jesus had that power. His notoriety had spread even into that Gentile area. And so they had heard about him, and they wanted their loved ones healed and so on. We still need to be bringing people to Jesus, don't we, for spiritual healing, because he can do that too. He's the great physician, and he is the author and finisher of our faith and the captain of our salvation, he is said to be. And in him alone is salvation found. So we need to introduce people to Christ. And sometimes maybe we're too timid or shy or just fearful to even say anything to people. Do you know about Jesus Christ? You know, we need to let people hear about him. We'll talk about some things that we need to give him credit for in the lesson on Sunday, Lord willing. The multitude marveled. They were amazed when they began to see or hear the dumb speaking, The maimed were made whole. Maybe somebody had had a terrible accident or born with some great deformity. And they brought them to Jesus, and He healed them, made them whole. The lame walked. You remember that case when a man was healed, he was lame and he was healed, and he came not walking, but leaping for joy. I've read a story or two about children who were blind. They were born blind and had never been able to see anything at all. And then their sight was restored. And it's so touching to read some of the things that they say when they first see themselves in a mirror, or they first see their mom or their dad or someone that they love very deeply, but they'd never seen them. Doc Watson, the great guitar player and musician and singer from the Carolina mountains, became blind. I believe there was some kind of an accident involved. I can't remember exactly what. But, boy, it never hindered his musical abilities. And he became such a great instrumentalist. And it was amazing. He played everywhere, played into his 80s, and I think he passed away. But his blindness never held him back. And sometimes it is said that blind people see better than those who have their sight, because their other senses are so sharpened that it's amazing, and we can be astounded by what they can do. But think of how these people would see all of these things. Look at what the result was. The record says they glorified, now notice how this is said. They glorified the God of Israel. Now that statement tells you that the people who are being healed and so on are Gentiles. Because if these had been Jewish people, the writer would probably have just said they glorified God. You see, the Gentiles had all other kinds of gods. But here it is specifically said that they glorified the God of Israel. Why didn't it say they glorified God? The fact that he says the God of Israel would imply that these were Gentiles who had come to recognize through the work of Jesus that the God of Israel is in fact the true God, the one and only God. You'll notice that Jesus summoned the disciples to discuss that situation, or this situation, verse 32. He said, I have compassion on the multitude. There's another good study for you. Take you a good reference Bible or a concordance and look at the word compassion and how many times Jesus is mentioned in connection with compassion. He had compassion on people. There was a tenderness about him, a mercifulness about him. And he was concerned about people, individuals, but a vast multitude. You know, we see the crowd sometimes on TV, and unless the camera zooms in on real close on one or two, you just see that mass of humanity. But regardless of how large a multitude Jesus had before him, he knew every one of them. He knows every one of us, doesn't he? Somebody made a statement not long ago that we needed to speak as if everything we say was being recorded. It is, isn't it? God hears it all. He knows exactly what we've said. And our words will be there even in the day of judgment. He said, by thy words thou shalt be justified, by thy words thou shalt be condemned. He sees our actions as well. He knows all that we do. But he had compassion on them. They had nothing to eat, and Jesus didn't want to send them away. Now, I don't think that these people came without anything at all to eat. They would have been famished after 3 days, wouldn't they? They probably, just like us, they brought something to eat, but sometimes you run out of food. You know, you don't take enough along with you. Sometimes you go on vacation, you don't take enough clothes with you. So you have to end up washing some or going out and buying some more or whatever. Well, they probably had some food, but it wasn't enough. And Jesus knew that if they left him and started to buy food, that they would have problems. And so he began to talk to the disciples about that, much as he had before. He said, if they leave, they'll become weary. Why? Because they've not had enough food. And they will faint in the way. So he didn't want them to be in danger. And there's some things here that need to be noted. They'd been with him 3 days. What does that tell you? They were really interested in what Jesus was doing and teaching. Their devotion, their interest, their gratitude, all of these are seen in the fact that they stayed there. They didn't leave. Second thing is, that compassion of Jesus really stands out. If he had such compassion for those who were physically sick and hungry, how much greater is his compassion upon those who are spiritually sick and hungry? You know he would have compassion upon them. And a great deal is said about the willingness of Jesus to forgive. Even from the cross, he prayed, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. He will not send us away hungry either if we'll come to him and stay with him. We'll be fully and completely satisfied if we'll drink of the water of life and eat the spiritual food that he's provided. Peter said, desire the sincere milk of the word, that you may grow thereby. In Hebrews 5:14, we're told that we need to be those who grow to the point where we can partake of the meat of the word too. And then that will nourish and strengthen us. We need not faint in the way. Paul and others said something about that. Paul in Galatians 6, I believe it is, said, be not weary in well-doing, for in due season you shall reap if you faint not. Don't faint. You got to keep on keeping on. Don't be weary in well-doing. Well, the disciples again began to question whether such a feat as feeding this vast multitude is possible. Now, it hadn't been long since he did that very thing. And they should have known better. But in view of the fact that they were in the wilderness and had little, if any, bread, how are we going to do that, Lord? There's nothing said in this account about a little boy having any bread. And we don't know where this bread came from exactly, the bread and the fishes, but evidently it was found among the disciples of Jesus, perhaps among the 12. Now, the remaining events in this chapter are very similar to what we studied in Matthew 14, 15 through 21. And that has led some people to be rather critical and say that, well, this is just another account, another fabrication of the previous feeding and a little bit different take on it. And they try to use this to try to show that there's contradictions and all of that in the Bible. Well, it won't work if you just read it and study it very carefully. Let me mention first the similarities between the feeding of the 5,000 earlier recorded and the feeding of the 4,000 here. First of all, both feedings have the same menu, the loaves and the fishes. That would be standard fare in their day. There are some areas that are known for certain foods. Jackson County, Tennessee was known for beans and taters when I grew up. We'd have beans and potatoes just about every day. And W.A. Gibbs would say, well, we had beans and potatoes one day, and the next day we had potatoes and beans, right, W.A.? And, you know, that was common fare. We grew a lot of our food. All of us, and R.W. and others still garden a lot and have a lot of foods that are sort of native to this area. Everybody loves the turnip greens, you know, when those come in. And some of us even venture to eat the turnips too. But the loaves and the fishes would have been common fare in that day and time. Some of you that have been to Southeast Asia, I believe they eat a lot of rice there, don't they? And maybe in India too. Where's Barry? Barry Cook could tell us about that. But anyway, the loaves and the fishes would have been staple food in that day. Jesus had the people to sit down to eat in both of the miracles. 5,000, he commanded them to sit down. The word command there carries with it the idea of one with authority. Commanded people to do a certain thing. This was a common practice. He also gave thanks, just like he did when he fed the 5,000. It's a marvelous example for all of us. We need to thank God for our daily bread. He blesses us so abundantly, but we need to be grateful and not to say, well, you know, he knows we're thankful and or knows whether or not we are. Just learn to express thanksgiving for your food and for all other blessings, and it will help us all to be better people. He broke the bread, gave it to the disciples gave it to the multitude. This was a procedure in both incidents. Same procedure was done. And, you know, sometimes we say, well, that's just routine. Same old routine. There's a lot of routines that are not bad. Just because a thing is done routinely doesn't mean that it has to just be routinely. You stop and think about the things that we do repetitively over and over and over again. And sometimes people say, boy, that would be terrible. Do you know a survey was done many years ago which asked the people taking the survey if they knew they had only one day to live, what would you do? And amazingly, when they polled those answers, the vast majority described a routine day. I'd love to get up and have breakfast with my spouse. Have a hot cup of coffee first thing in the morning. You know, I'd like to sit on the porch with my spouse. Just things like that. Have all the kids around. Be able to take a walk. Things like that. Just routine things. Routines are not always bad. It's not a bad routine to always be present for worship and Bible study. Not a bad routine to read and study your Bible and pray every day. Not a bad routine to tell your spouse, I love you, and your children that you love them. Those are good things. you know. Heard a man say one time, and I don't know if he was joking or not, he didn't seem like it. I told her I loved her the day I married her, and if I ever changed my mind, I'd let her know. That's not really a good approach to marital bliss. I don't think. And the same thing would be true with the wife as well. Both feedings involved men, women, and children. Now, you might read that and never think about it. But there was a cog started turning in my noggin that maybe had been still for a long time. How about that? What a practical lesson. Isn't it wonderful for families to eat together? And I'd read that hundreds of times probably and never thought about that from the standpoint of this miracle. It's great for families to eat together. Some of you probably heard me tell this before. I haven't forgotten it. And I hadn't forgotten it, I repeated it. I'm getting older and I do forget things. I lost my billfold and my checkbook today. But guess what? I remembered exactly where they were. I had to drive about 15 miles to get them, but I knew exactly where they were. I remembered leaving them there. But this story was about the Chinese in New York City. The police there noticed that there were very few crimes committed by young Chinese men. And they wanted to find out why. So they went to the older men, the patriarchs among the Chinese families, and asked them for, what's your advice? They said, we want every member of the family to be present at supper time for the evening meal. Everybody is supposed to be there. Well, what'd you do at supper? We talked about the day. We talked about any problems that had arisen. How do you handle that? How do you respond to that? Parents knew where their kids were. Remember Channel 4 many years ago? It's 10 o'clock. Do you know where your children are? I believe it was 10. It might have been 11. But anyway, I've never forgotten that. But men, women, and children are involved in both of them. But there's some differences. No mention is made in the second feeding of the 4,000 of the boy, or a boy with the loaves and the fishes. That's mentioned in connection with the first feeding. In the feeding of the 5,000, the people sat on grass. In the feeding of the 4,000, they sat on the ground. That has led some to conjecture that it had grown later into the summer, and the grass was now dried, and they sat on the ground as opposed to sitting on the green grass. The number of loaves and fish are different, or is different in the two accounts. 5 loaves and 2 fish in the feeding of the 5,000, 7 loaves and a few little fishes in the second one. We don't know exactly how many fish there were, but a very small amount. The number of baskets of fragments differ. There was 12 in the 5,000, 7 here. But it's an interesting little difference that you probably don't note in just reading the English. The word for basket in the first feeding, the 5,000, is a small basket. The word for basket in the feeding of the 4,000 is a large basket. How much larger? We don't know, but it's a larger size basket. So there may have been more fragments gathered in the second feeding than in the first, because the first baskets were small. These were large. There's a different Greek term used in those. Now, here is the clincher as far as I'm concerned. Jesus in Matthew 16, 9 and 10 states very clearly to his disciples, do you not remember when I fed the 5,000? In the next verse he says, do you not remember when I fed the 4,000? So Jesus, we have Jesus' word for it, that there are two completely separate incidents. And here I think is a very important point to remember. The feeding of the 5,000 involved Jewish people. The second miracle involved Gentiles. Now, what does that tell us? It tells us Jesus is capable of feeding the Jews and the Gentiles, satisfying both of them. They could go away filled, and he can do the same thing spiritually. And I think that's the great lesson that we need to take away from this particular section tonight. Well, I haven't asked a lot of questions, so you haven't been able to talk. I'll try to ask more questions the next time, but we do appreciate your good attention as always.